Hello BookTube, I am finally getting around to my nonfiction wrap-up for August. I have already filmed this once, so hopefully we can get through this pretty quickly. I read 8 nonfiction books in the month of August, which I think I'm pretty impressed with. I thank BookTube for increasing the number of books that I'm reading again. And if you want to see a video on how I am increasing the amount that I read, I might do that later. The first was Take 6 Girls, The Lives of the Mitford Sisters. If you go into this book not already knowing some about each of those sisters' lives and how their background impacted their lives and what their ultimate life ended up being, then you have no idea what's going on. I actually didn't finish this one. I got about 3/4 of the way through and was just done. I couldn't keep up with the people and I kept jumping backward and forward in time and not just referring to an event. If they mentioned someone in passing, it would go from 1900 to 1960 and then 1901 and then someone else and then their sister and then they're related to this person and then that person died and then left them this and that was why this happened. It just didn't have a cohesive thread throughout the book. So I think I gave this a 2 stars or something like that on Goodreads. It wasn't as good. It has a great potential, and the writing, when it wasn't bouncing back and forth in time nonsensically, was good. It just needs sort of a cohesive editor's eye, and then I think I would reread it. The next book that I read was Packing for Mars, The Curious Science of Life in the Void, and I have a full review that I just posted on this one, including my thoughts on the book and also some just general facts from when I worked for NASA. I was a science intern for a summer in the nutritional biochemistry lab, which is ultimately what I ended up doing. I am a nutritional biochemist, an analytical chemist, and I got my start being exposed to that at Johnson Space Center. So I kind of wrapped those things up and have that view on this book. Overall, I enjoyed this book. The full review will be linked down below, as I mentioned. The next book that I read was Wonder Women, 25 Innovators, Inventors, and Trailblazers Who Trained History. And this focuses on 25 unique perspectives and sort of small biographies of women. And I think that the book did a really good job of mixing up the backgrounds of the women that they selected. I think that a lot of it was lacking in depth. Some of the women who were highlighted really only had a couple paragraphs of information. Others had a few pages. They did have a diverse background, which I did enjoy. The other thing that sort of bothered me about this novel was that it is marketed as an adult novel, but the cover art on the front reads a lot more middle grade to me, and the book itself I think reads a lot more middle grade or sort of young adult. If I was recommending this to an adult, I would not rate it very highly, but this is a book that I would definitely give to my niece or to cousins who are somewhere between the age of like 8 and 12 or maybe 8 and 14, somewhere between the age where they get a lot of common popular culture, because they worked a lot of that into this book, which is another thing that made it less enjoyable as an adult, honestly. But it made it, I think, more relatable for a younger reader. It's also a really great introduction into lots of different career paths, which is another reason that I think if they change the target audience to where this book is more recommended to a younger audience, I think that I would rate this more of a 4-star book. Marketed for adults, I wouldn't read this. I wouldn't recommend it to women my age. I also wouldn't recommend it to people who are interested in women scientists, because it didn't give you enough about any of them. And it also, there's other books that I would recommend for a variety of women in science, more at our reading level. But as I said, if you're recommending and you need a recommendation for a young girl particularly, this would be an excellent find, and I think it would be very enjoyable and readable for them, and it would also give them a great starting point for reading about different professions, whether by women or from men or throughout history or just the background on a particular kind of science. I think this is a great starting point. The next book that I read was The Madame Curie Complex, The Hidden History of Women in Science. And when I originally picked this up, I think it was branded as sort of a complete history of women in science, sort of, but it's really not. Each individual chapter focuses on one woman. It has great references if you want to do a follow-up and you are a woman that is more interested in women in science or women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, then I would more recommend the Madame Curie complex over the Wonder Woman, just because the writing level is a little higher. It also has a really great reference section, so if you are interested in the biography of Madame Curie, then you can look up more information on her and a lot of other people. Gertie Corey, I'm really interested in her. She discovered the Corey cycle, and the chapters aren't very long, but they're long enough to give you a good kind of overview of each woman, sort of their beginnings, their upbringing, their educational history, some of the struggles that they had to overcome, most often married life, and then what they did with their scientific careers and their perception by their coworkers and peers. And the only problem with this book is it's extremely repetitive, because it isn't a cohesive novel where they just introduce sort of chronologically scientific discoveries throughout time and the women who made them. It is more of a repetition of similar struggles that every woman had to overcome, not only being a woman and being locked out of the lab in a lot of cases, or having the husband that allows you to access to these resources until his death, which is the case for a few of the women, but also the struggle of work and career versus home and family. And that was a very common theme throughout all of them. So I thought that it's extremely important, and I do think that's still a struggle, but it became a little repetitive for a novel, because I'm reading a few pages for every single one of these essays is the exact, basically copy paste of the same struggle for every woman, which is sad, and it's disheartening, but it kind of detracted a little from the impact that I think this book could have had otherwise. The next book that I read, which I raved about already, was The Geek Feminist Revolution by Kameron Hurley. I thought that was amazing. I'm a geek, I'm not a writer, so the beginning chapters on writing I was a little less interested in, but everything else was spot on. I loved the individual essays. It was also slightly repetitive in places. She talked about Conan a lot, but a lot of the references I really enjoyed, and it was sort of sporadic throughout the novel, so it wasn't really distracting for me. I would highly recommend this collection of essays to anyone who is interested. I had some really good reads this month. My next was a video that I've already done a full review on, and I also raved about this one, which was 7 Brief Lessons on Physics. And I will read more by this author. I've greatly enjoyed this. It was easily accessible. It gave you a good insight into scientific thinking, but also just the thrill of discovery and scientific responsibility. And I go into this really in depth in the full review, so if this is something that you might be interested in, it has 7 core concepts for physics in a very approachable, readable way. And look into the other video if you want a full sort of rundown prior to reading, but I highly recommend this. It's also right around 100 pages or something, so it's a really quick, easy, deep read for such a small book. One of the books that I finished in August that I had actually started in July was After the Reich, The Brutal History of Allied Occupation. I had such high hopes for this book, and it was extremely graphic and moving and touching in places, and then I also did not finish this one. It became very anti-Russian and wasn't sort of a take on Allied occupation really at all. I think if you're interested in specific cities, or if you need a good resource jackpot, so you have something that's sort of a really great reference to a lot of primary source material, this book would be a great start. It is extremely graphic in places and talks about all the atrocities of war, so keep that in mind. And the last book that I read, which is actually, I think, the first book that I finished last month. I had also started this, and it was an audiobook that I read throughout July and then finished the first part of August. And that is The Worst Hard Time, the untold story of those who survived the Great American Dust Bowl. I don't know really anything about that time period, and this was excellent. This was long, and it was detailed, and it was horribly heart-wrenching at times, and the fact that, I mean, just everything that happened that was related to this book was just mind-blowing for me. The idea of advertising land as being lush and green and tree-covered, and these pre-built settlements and sort of subdivisions, and then nowhere even close to that reality when people have already purchased the land, and the environmental implications of what they were told with misinformation to do. This was an excellent book, and I highly recommend it. I think I gave this between 4 and 5 stars. I'm not sure which way I actually swayed now, because I think I finished the very first day of August, this book last month, so I'm not sure, because it doesn't do half stars, which side of the fence I fell on when I actually wrote it. But I think this is one of those books that I might reread. It's also one of those books that the more I think about, the better that it's getting, because of all of the points that you don't get that first pass through, and when you sort of chew on them for a while, you become more appalled, and it's kind of sparked me. I want to read more about this period. I want to read more sort of survival tales of people and the Dust Bowl and the Depression, and this book sort of sparked all of that, so I highly recommend it if you've not picked it up. Okay, so my air is off, and it's like a bazillion degrees in here, so I'm gonna wrap everything up. These are all of my nonfiction reads for the month of August, and I hope you liked this. Thank you everyone who recommended books that were on this list.